The temperature had plunged to 15 below zero during the night, and the dawn broke over Fort Garland, Colorado, with fingers of pale gold light that did nothing to warm the frozen January landscape of 1882. Warren Zimmerman had been riding since before first light, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter air as his horse picked its way carefully along the icy trail that led toward the old McAllister ranch, when he heard it. A sound so broken and raw that it pierced through the howling wind and made him pull his gelding to an immediate halt. Someone was crying, the kind of weeping that came from a soul torn open and bleeding, and Warren's instinct told him that leaving whoever it was out here in this killing cold would be signing their death warrant. He urged his horse forward, following the sound until he came upon the abandoned well that sat at the edge of what used to be productive farmland before the drought had driven the family away 3 years back. The well had been dry even then, and now it was just a stone circle covered with a wooden cap that had long since warped and split. Kneeling beside it with her hands pressed against the frozen stones was a young woman whose dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her dress was thin, far too thin for this weather, and she wore no coat despite the deadly cold. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that Warren recognized as the first signs of hypothermia. He dismounted quickly, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as he approached her with his hands raised to show he meant no harm. She looked up at him with eyes the color of honey that were red-rimmed and swollen from crying, and he saw no fear in them, only a desperate emptiness that made his chest tighten. "Miss," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle despite the urgency he felt, "you cannot stay out here. This cold will kill you before the hour is out." "Let it," she whispered, her voice hoarse and cracking. "I have nothing left, nothing to go back to." Warren crouched down beside her, shrugging off his heavy wool coat despite the immediate bite of cold against his own skin. He draped it around her shoulders, and she flinched at the contact but did not pull away. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features that would have been beautiful if they were not currently twisted with anguish. "Tell me your pain so I can carry it," he said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him that he did not quite understand. His mother used to say that some people were born with hearts meant to bear the weight of others' sorrows, and Warren had always suspected he was one of them. "Whatever burden has brought you out here to freeze, it does not have to be yours alone." She stared at him for a long moment, and he watched as something shifted behind those honey-colored eyes, a tiny crack in the wall of despair that had surrounded her. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, and when the words finally came, they spilled out in a rush like water from a broken dam. "My father," she began, her voice shaking. "My father owed money to a man named Silas Crenshaw. Gambling debts that kept mounting higher and higher no matter how hard we tried to pay them down. 3 months ago, my father had an accident at the mine where he worked. A cave-in. He lingered for 2 weeks before he died, and in that time, the debts only grew worse because we could not work while we tended to him." Warren listened without interrupting, his blue eyes fixed on her face as she spoke. The wind whipped around them, but he barely felt it, all his attention focused on this broken young woman and the story she was finally releasing. "When he died, Crenshaw came to our house. My mother had passed when I was 12, so there was only me and my younger brother, Samuel. He is 16, just a boy still, though he tries so hard to be a man." Her voice caught on a sob, and she pressed her fist against her mouth as if trying to physically hold back the grief. "Crenshaw said the debt passed to me, $500. We had nothing. Nothing. The house was barely standing, and everything of value had already been sold. He gave you a choice, Warren said quietly, because he had seen enough of men like Silas Crenshaw to know how this story would unfold. She nodded, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. Work for him to pay off the debt, he said. But I knew what that meant. Everyone knows what happens to the girls who work in Crenshaw's saloon. They do not just serve drinks and deal cards, and even if I had been willing to do that for myself, he wanted Samuel too. Said a boy that age could work in his other enterprises. She practically spat the last word, her hands clenching into fists. I know what those enterprises are. The opium den he runs behind the false wall in his back room, the stolen goods he moves through his warehouse. My brother would have been corrupted or killed within a year. So you ran, Warren said. I told Samuel to head east to our aunt in Kansas City. I gave him what little money we had left, enough for a train ticket and a few meals. He did not want to go without me, but I made him understand that if Crenshaw caught us together, we would both be trapped. If I stayed behind and faced Crenshaw alone, Samuel would at least have a chance. She drew a shuddering breath, her whole body trembling now from both cold and emotion. I went to Crenshaw yesterday morning and told him that Samuel had run away, that I did not know where he was. He did not believe me. He locked me in a room above the saloon while his men went to search the house. I knew they would not find anything because Samuel had left the night before, but I also knew that when they came back, Crenshaw would make an example of me. Warren felt his jaw tighten with anger, but he kept his voice calm. How did you get away? There was a loose board in the floor. I worked it free and squeezed through into the space between the floors. It was tight and full of mice, but I made it through and found my way to a back stairwell that led to the alley. I ran. I just ran without thinking, and I ended up here at this old well. She looked down at the frozen stones beneath her hands. My mother used to bring me here when I was small, before the well went dry, before everything fell apart. I remembered how peaceful it used to be, how safe I felt. I thought perhaps if I came here, I could feel that safety one more time before I gave up entirely. Gave up? Warren reached out slowly and gently took one of her frozen hands in his own. Her fingers were like ice, and he began rubbing them carefully to restore circulation. You mean freeze to death out here? I have nowhere to go, she whispered. Crenshaw owns half this town, and the other half is too afraid of him to help me. If I stay, he will find me and force me into his service. If I run, I have no money, no provisions, no way to survive. And even if I managed to make it somewhere else, I would always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to find me. This seemed like the only way to be free of him for good. Warren was quiet for a moment, still holding her frozen hand in his, and using his other hand to rub warmth back into her arm through the sleeve of his coat that she now wore. His mind was working quickly, sorting through options and possibilities with the methodical approach he had learned during his years as a ranch foreman. Finally, he looked up and met her eyes with a steadiness that seemed to anchor her to something solid. My name is Warren Zimmerman, he said. I work as the foreman on the Double R Ranch about 10 miles north of town. The ranch is owned by Robert Rutherford, and he is a good man, an honest man who has no love for Silas Crenshaw or his kind. What is your name? She hesitated, and he could see the fear in her eyes, the instinctive wariness of trusting anyone after what she had been through. But something in his steady gaze seemed to convince her, and she answered in a voice barely above a whisper. Josephine. Josephine Hayes. Well, Miss Hayes, I am going to make you a promise right here and now. Warren squeezed her hand gently, willing her to believe him. You are not going to freeze to death by this well, and you are not going to end up in Silas Crenshaw's clutches either. You are going to come back to the Double R with me, and we are going to figure out a way to solve this problem that does not involve you giving up your life or your freedom. Do you understand?" "You do not know what you are offering," Josephine said, but he could hear a tiny thread of hope weaving through her words. "Crenshaw is dangerous. If he finds out you helped me, he will come after you too." "Let him try," Warren said with a quiet confidence that came from years of facing down everything from stampeding cattle to armed cattle thieves. "I have dealt with worse than Silas Crenshaw, and I am still here. Now can you stand? We need to get you somewhere warm before this cold does permanent damage." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out beneath her. She had been kneeling on that frozen ground for hours, he realized, and the cold had seeped deep into her muscles and bones. He lifted her onto his horse with an ease that spoke of his strength, then mounted behind her and wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady. She leaned back against his chest, and he could feel her trembling despite the coat he had given her. The ride back to the Double R Ranch took nearly an hour, and Warren used that time to tell Josephine about the place she was heading to and the people who lived there. Robert Rutherford had built the ranch 20 years ago with his wife Margaret, and together they had created one of the most successful cattle operations in southern Colorado. They had 3 children, all grown now, and a staff of about 15 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. There was also a main house where the Rutherfords lived, a foreman's cabin where Warren stayed, and a guest cottage that had been built for Margaret's mother but now sat empty after the old woman had passed away 2 years before. "You could stay in the guest cottage," Warren said as they rode. "It is small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it is warm and dry and private. In exchange for room and board, you could help Margaret with the household work. She has been saying for months that she needs an extra pair of hands now that her daughter moved to Denver." "And you think they would agree to this?" Josephine asked. "Taking in a stranger who is running from debts she cannot pay, your father's debts, not yours," Warren corrected firmly. "And yes, I think they will agree once they hear your story. Robert Rutherford is the kind of man who believes in helping people who are trying to help themselves. You are not asking for charity. You are offering honest work in exchange for protection and a chance to start fresh." They crested a ridge, and the Double R Ranch spread out below them in the valley. Even in the harsh winter landscape, it was an impressive sight with its sturdy buildings and well-maintained fences. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the main house, and Warren could see figures moving around the barnyard, attending to the morning chores despite the cold. He guided his horse down the slope and directly to the main house, knowing that the sooner he spoke to Robert and Margaret, the sooner they could get Josephine settled and safe. Robert Rutherford was a tall man in his mid-50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and sharp green eyes that missed very little. He came out onto the porch when he heard the horse approaching, and his expression shifted from curiosity to concern when he saw Warren riding double with a young woman wrapped in his coat. "Warren, what happened?" Robert called out as Warren dismounted and reached up to help Josephine down. "We need to talk," Warren said. "Inside, where it is warm. Miss Hayes here is in trouble, and I believe we can help her." Margaret Rutherford appeared in the doorway, a woman whose kind face and warm brown eyes had comforted many a ranch hand through illness or injury over the years. She took one look at Josephine's pale face and frozen appearance, and immediately went into action, ushering the young woman inside and toward the large fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. "Robert, get some blankets from the bedroom," Margaret ordered, already helping Josephine out of Warren's coat and checking her hands and feet for signs of frostbite. "Warren, there is hot coffee on the stove and some breakfast left over from earlier. Make sure she eats something warm." Over the next hour, with Josephine wrapped in blankets by the fire and sipping hot coffee that gradually brought color back to her cheeks, Warren told the Rutherfords everything that Josephine had shared with him. Robert listened with a deepening frown, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced slowly in front of the fire. Margaret sat beside Josephine, occasionally reaching out to pat the young woman's hand in a gesture of comfort and support. When Warren finished speaking, Robert was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. Finally, he turned to look at Josephine with those penetrating green eyes. "Miss Hayes, I want you to understand something," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "What Warren has told me confirms what I have long suspected about Silas Crenshaw's operations in Fort Garland. The man is a blight on this territory, and I have no doubt that everything you have said about him is true. However, if we take you in here and offer you protection, we will be making an enemy of him. I need to know that you are telling us the complete truth before I make that decision." Josephine met his gaze without flinching, and Warren felt a surge of admiration for her courage. Even exhausted and frightened, she held herself with a dignity that commanded respect. "I swear to you on my mother's grave that every word I have spoken is true," she said clearly. "My father was a good man who made poor choices. My brother is innocent of everything except being born into an impossible situation. And I would rather die than become what Silas Crenshaw wanted to make me. If you choose not to help me, I understand, but please do not think that I have lied to you." Robert studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you, Miss Hayes, and as it happens, I have been looking for a reason to take a stand against Crenshaw for some time now. He has been trying to buy up land in this valley, using intimidation and dirty tactics to force people to sell. 3 of my neighbors have already given in to his pressure, and I know it is only a matter of time before he sets his sights on the Double R." "Robert," Margaret said, a note of warning in her voice, "you know how dangerous this could be." "I do," her husband agreed. "But I also know that if good people keep backing down from bullies like Crenshaw, eventually there will be no good people left, only victims and cowards. I would rather be neither." He turned back to Josephine. "Warren's idea about you staying in the guest cottage and helping Margaret around the house is a sound one. You will have shelter, food, and the protection of this ranch and everyone who works here. In return, I ask only that you be honest with us and work hard. Is that acceptable to you?" Tears welled up in Josephine's eyes, but these were different from the desperate tears Warren had witnessed at the frozen well. These were tears of relief and gratitude, and they made her honey-colored eyes shine in the firelight. "More than acceptable," she whispered. Thank you so much." "Do not thank us yet," Robert said, but there was a slight smile on his weathered face. "Margaret will work you hard, I promise you that. She has been saving up a list of tasks for months, waiting for someone to help her tackle them." Margaret laughed and swatted her husband's arm affectionately. "Do not listen to him, dear. I am a perfectly reasonable taskmaster. Now, let me show you to the guest cottage so you can rest properly. You look like you have not slept in days." "I have not," Josephine admitted. "I was too frightened to close my eyes while I was locked in that room, and after I escaped, I just kept walking until I ended up at the well." Warren followed as Margaret led Josephine across the yard to the guest cottage, carrying an armful of linens and supplies that Margaret pressed into his arms. The cottage was indeed small, as he had described, but it was well built and snug against the cold. The front room served as both a sitting area and bedroom, with a narrow bed against one wall and a rocking chair near a small wood stove. The back room held a simple kitchen with a pump for water and a few shelves for dishes and food stores. It was humble, but it was clean and warm, and Warren saw Josephine's shoulders relax as she stepped inside and looked around. "I will bring you some fresh clothes," Margaret said, already mentally cataloging what she had in her own wardrobe that might fit the younger woman. "You are about the same size as my daughter was before she married and moved away. Her old things are still packed away in a trunk, and I am sure she would not mind you making use of them." "I cannot repay you for all of this," Josephine said, her voice thick with emotion. "You will repay us by building yourself a new life," Margaret said firmly, taking the young woman's face between her hands in a motherly gesture. "That is payment enough. Now rest, and later we will talk about what needs to be done around here. But for now, just let yourself be safe." After Margaret returned to the main house, Warren lingered in the doorway of the cottage, watching as Josephine sank onto the bed with an expression of exhausted relief. She looked up at him, and their eyes met across the small room. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. "You do not know me. You had no reason to stop when you heard me crying, no reason to offer me your coat or bring me here. Why did you do it?" Warren leaned against the door frame, considering her question carefully. The truth was he was not entirely sure himself why he had felt such a strong compulsion to help this stranger. Why the sound of her weeping had cut through him like a knife and made it impossible to simply ride past. There had been something in that moment by the frozen well, something that felt like fate or destiny or whatever word people used when they could not explain the pull they felt toward another person. "I suppose, because I know what it is like to feel alone and desperate," he finally said. "My parents died when I was 17, killed by a fever that swept through our town one winter. I had 2 younger sisters to care for and no way to provide for them. Robert Rutherford gave me a job when no one else would take a chance on a grieving boy with no experience. He gave me a purpose and a place to belong when I needed it most. My sisters are grown now, both married to good men and living happy lives, but I never forgot what Robert did for me. I suppose helping you is my way of passing that kindness forward." Josephine nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "Your parents would be proud of the man you became," she said. "I can tell that much just from the short time I have known you." Something warm unfurled in Warren's chest at her words, a feeling he could not quite name, but that made him want to do everything in his power to protect this woman and help her find her way back to happiness. He tipped his hat to her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Get some rest, Miss Hayes. Tomorrow will come soon enough, and with it, all the challenges we will need to face together." He pulled the door closed behind him and walked back toward the barn, his mind already working through what would need to be done to keep Josephine safe. Silas Crenshaw was not a man who gave up easily, especially when he felt someone had stolen something he considered his property. Warren knew it was only a matter of time before Crenshaw learned that Josephine was at the Double R, and when that happened, there would be trouble. But Warren had meant what he said to her earlier. He had dealt with worse and survived. He would not let Crenshaw take Josephine away from the safety she had finally found. The days that followed settled into a routine that brought structure and purpose back into Josephine's life. She woke each morning before dawn and made her way to the main house, where she helped Margaret prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. After the men had eaten and headed out to their various tasks, she and Margaret would tackle the endless list of household chores: laundry, mending, cleaning, baking bread, preserving vegetables, and a dozen other tasks that kept a ranch household running smoothly. Margaret proved to be exactly what Josephine needed: a strong, capable woman who did not pity her but instead treated her as an equal and a friend. They worked side by side, and as they worked, they talked. Josephine found herself opening up about her childhood, about her mother who had died too young, about her father's slow descent into gambling and debt. Margaret listened without judgment, occasionally sharing stories of her own struggles when she and Robert had first started the ranch with nothing but determination, and a piece of land that everyone else had dismissed as too difficult to farm. Warren made a point of checking in on Josephine each day, often finding small excuses to stop by the main house or the guest cottage. He brought her firewood for her stove, repaired a loose shutter on her window, and once even surprised her with a small bouquet of dried wildflowers he had found preserved in the barn, left over from the previous summer. These small gestures touched Josephine more deeply than she could express, and she found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that went beyond simple gratitude. He was different from any man she had ever known. Where her father had been weak and prone to making excuses, Warren was strong and decisive. Where the men in Crenshaw's orbit had been crude and threatening, Warren was respectful and gentle. He had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and a quiet confidence that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her mother was alive. She caught herself watching him sometimes when he did not know she was looking, admiring the capable way he moved, the patience he showed with the animals and the ranch hands he supervised, the thoughtfulness he brought to every task. 3 weeks after Josephine arrived at the Double R, the situation with Silas Crenshaw finally came to a head. Robert had gone into Fort Garland to conduct some business at the bank, and when he returned that evening, his expression was grim. He called Warren into his study, and Josephine, who had been helping Margaret prepare dinner, felt her stomach drop with dread. Margaret seemed to sense her fear and laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever it is, we will face it together," she said firmly. "You are not alone anymore, Josephine. Do not forget that." When Robert and Warren emerged from the study half an hour later, both men looked troubled but determined. Robert beckoned Josephine into the room, and she followed with her heart pounding against her ribs. Once they were all seated, Robert leaned back in his chair and fixed her with a steady gaze. "Crenshaw knows you are here," he said without preamble. "He confronted me at the bank this afternoon, claimed you owe him money and that I am harboring his property. I told him in no uncertain terms that you are a free citizen and that he has no legal claim on you, but he was not interested in legal arguments. He threatened to come out here and take you by force if necessary." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. "I should leave," she said immediately, standing up so quickly that her chair nearly toppled backward. "I cannot let him hurt you and Margaret because of me. I will go tonight right now, before he has a chance to follow through on his threat." "Sit down, Miss Hayes," Robert said, his voice firm but not harsh. "You are not going anywhere. I do not make promises lightly, and I promised you protection when you came here. That promise still stands." "But he will come," Josephine said, her voice rising with panic. "He will bring his men and people will get hurt. I cannot have that on my conscience." Warren moved to stand beside her chair, placing a hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was grounding, pulling her back from the edge of panic. "We have a plan," he said quietly. "Listen to what Robert has to say before you make any decisions." She sank back into the chair, and Robert leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk. "I have been doing some research into Silas Crenshaw's business dealings," he said. "It turns out that the man has made quite a few enemies over the years, including Sheriff Tom Bradley. Bradley is an honest lawman, one of the few in Fort Garland who has not been corrupted or intimidated by Crenshaw's influence. I spoke with him this afternoon after my encounter with Crenshaw, and we have come up with a solution that should solve your problem permanently." "What kind of solution?" Josephine asked warily. "Your father's gambling debts," Robert said. They were contracted under circumstances that make them legally questionable at best. Bradley did some digging and discovered that Crenshaw was running illegal gambling operations, using weighted dice and marked cards to cheat his customers. Any debts incurred through such operations are not enforceable under territorial law. Bradley is prepared to testify to this in court if necessary, and he has agreed to serve Crenshaw with a legal notice stating that he has no claim on you or your brother. Hope flickered in Josephine's chest, but it was tempered by fear. Crenshaw will not care about what is legal, she said. He makes his own rules. Which is why the second part of the plan is important, Warren interjected. Bradley is going to deputize several men, including me and 2 of the other ranch hands from the Double R. We will be sworn officers of the law, authorized to use force if necessary to protect you from Crenshaw or any of his men. If he comes here and tries to take you, he will be attempting to kidnap a citizen under the protection of the law, and we will have every right to stop him. Josephine looked between the 2 men, seeing the determination in their faces and feeling tears prick at her eyes once more. "You would do all of this for me," she whispered. "Risk yourselves this way. This is not just about you anymore," Robert said, though his expression softened. "Crenshaw has been a cancer in this territory for too long. It is time someone stood up to him and showed that his intimidation tactics will not work forever. You have given us a reason and a legal standing to do just that. In helping you, we help everyone else he has victimized over the years." Warren squeezed her shoulder gently. "You are not a burden, Josephine. You are a catalyst for change. There is a difference." The next morning, Warren rode into Fort Garland along with 2 other ranch hands, Jack Murphy and Sam Torres, both of whom had worked for Robert for over a decade and could be trusted completely. They met Sheriff Bradley at his office, a small building on the main street that looked almost comically inadequate for the task of maintaining law and order in a town where men like Silas Crenshaw operated. But Tom Bradley himself was anything but inadequate. He was a compact man in his 40s with steel gray hair and eyes that held the kind of hardness that came from seeing too much of humanity's dark side. "You boys ready to uphold the law?" Bradley asked as he pinned deputy badges onto each of their shirts. "Because once you wear these, Crenshaw is going to see you as the enemy." "We are ready," Warren said firmly, and Jack and Sam nodded their agreement. Bradley handed Warren a sealed envelope. "This is the legal notice for Crenshaw. It states that Josephine Hayes owes him nothing, and that any attempt to collect on her father's debts or to harass her in any way will result in criminal charges. I would deliver it myself, but I think it will have more impact coming from you, given that you are the one protecting her." Warren tucked the envelope inside his coat and tipped his hat to the sheriff. "We will make sure he understands the message." The 4 men walked together down the main street of Fort Garland toward Crenshaw's saloon, a large building with a garish painted sign and windows that never seemed to let out enough light to dispel the shadows within. Warren had been in the place a handful of times over the years, always leaving with a bad taste in his mouth and a desire to wash the stink of corruption off his skin. Now, with the deputy badge pinned to his chest and the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, he pushed open the swinging doors and stepped inside. The saloon was busy despite the early hour, filled with men drinking and gambling away money they probably could not afford to lose. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer, and a piano player in the corner pounded out a jaunty tune that clashed with the grim atmosphere. Conversations died away as Warren and the others walked in, their badges glinting in the lamplight, and all eyes turned toward the back of the room where Silas Crenshaw held court at his private table. Crenshaw was a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair, slicked back with pomade, and a carefully groomed mustache that did nothing to soften the cruelty of his features. He was dressed expensively, his vest adorned with a gold watch chain and his fingers heavy with rings, all of it paid for with money extracted from the suffering of others. When he saw Warren approaching, his eyes narrowed, and a cold smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Crenshaw drawled, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated nonchalance. "Warren Zimmerman, is it? I heard you were playing hero for a little thief who ran off with something that belongs to me." Warren stopped a few feet from the table, his hands resting loosely at his sides in a deceptively relaxed pose that fooled no one. "Josephine Hayes does not belong to you or anyone else. She is a free woman and she owes you nothing." "Is that so?" Crenshaw's smile widened, showing teeth. "I have a signed marker from her father promising $500. That debt passes to his children according to the terms he agreed to." "Terms that were part of an illegal gambling operation," Warren said, pulling out the envelope and tossing it onto the table in front of Crenshaw. "Sheriff Bradley has investigated your establishment and found evidence that you have been running crooked games for years. Any debts incurred here are void under territorial law. That document is a legal notice informing you that you have no claim on Miss Hayes or her brother. If you attempt to collect on this supposed debt or harass them in any way, you will be arrested and charged." Crenshaw did not bother to open the envelope. Instead, he picked it up between two fingers as if it were something distasteful and dropped it onto the floor. "I do not give a damn about territorial law or that puppet sheriff. The girl owes me, and I will collect what is mine." "Then you will be breaking the law," Warren said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "And as a deputized officer, I will have the authority and the responsibility to stop you." Crenshaw's eyes flickered to the badge on Warren's chest, and for the first time, a hint of uncertainty crossed his face. But it was quickly replaced by rage, his face flushing dark red as he slammed his fist on the table. "You think a tin badge is going to protect you? I own this town, Zimmerman. I can make you and that self-righteous rancher of yours disappear without a trace." "You can try," Warren said, meeting Crenshaw's furious gaze without flinching. "But I think you will find that Robert Rutherford and the people who work for him are not as easy to intimidate as the folks you have been pushing around. Come after Miss Hayes or anyone at the Double R, and you will find out just how hard we can push back." For a long moment, the saloon was utterly silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press against everyone present like a physical weight. Then Crenshaw leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried through the entire room. "This is not over, Zimmerman, not by a long shot. You have made an enemy today, and I promise you will regret it." "I will take my chances," Warren said. He turned and walked out of the saloon, his back straight and his stride confident, even though every instinct screamed at him to watch for a knife or a bullet. Jack and Sam flanked him, and behind them, he could hear the scrape of chairs as several of Crenshaw's men started to rise, only to be stopped by a sharp word from their boss. They made it outside without incident, but Warren did not relax until they were mounted and riding out of town. As they left Fort Garland behind, Jack let out a long breath and shook his head. "That could have gone badly," he said. "It still might," Warren replied. "Crenshaw is not going to let this go. We need to be ready for whatever he tries next." Back at the Double R, Josephine was waiting anxiously for their return. She had tried to keep busy helping Margaret, but her mind kept wandering to Warren and what might be happening in town. When she finally heard the sound of horses approaching, she ran out of the main house and across the yard, her heart in her throat. Relief flooded through her when she saw Warren riding at the head of the group, alive and apparently unharmed. He dismounted and caught her as she stumbled to a halt in front of him, her hands reaching out instinctively to touch his arms, his chest, assuring herself that he was really there and whole. "Are you all right?" she asked breathlessly. "What happened?" "I am fine," he assured her, his hands coming up to steady her. "We delivered the notice, and Crenshaw knows where things stand. He was not happy about it, but there was nothing he could do without breaking the law in front of witnesses." "He will retaliate," Josephine said, fear making her voice sharp. "You know he will." "Probably," Warren agreed, "but we will be ready for him. Robert has already arranged for extra men to patrol the ranch boundaries, and Bradley is keeping an eye on Crenshaw's activities in town. We have done everything we can to protect you and everyone here." Josephine looked up into his blue eyes and saw the determination there, the unwavering commitment to keeping her safe. Something shifted in her chest, a feeling that went far beyond gratitude or relief. She realized in that moment that she was falling in love with this man who had found her weeping by a frozen well and had offered to carry her pain. The realization should have frightened her, coming as it did in the middle of so much chaos and danger, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Thank you," she said softly, her hands still resting on his arms, "for everything you have done, for everything you are doing." "I do not know how I will ever repay you." Warren smiled, that gentle smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "You do not need to repay me, Josephine. Just be safe and let yourself heal. That is all I want." The days that followed were tense with waiting. Crenshaw made no move against the ranch, but his silence felt more threatening than any open confrontation might have been. Warren found himself unable to fully relax, always watching, always listening for any sign of trouble. The other ranch hands felt it too, and the atmosphere at the Double R took on a watchful, guarded quality. Through it all, Josephine continued with her work, refusing to let fear paralyze her. She found strength in routine, in the simple tasks that filled her days and gave her purpose. And she found strength in Warren, whose steady presence became the anchor she clung to when doubt and worry threatened to overwhelm her. They began spending more time together in the evenings after the day's work was done. Warren would stop by the guest cottage with some excuse about checking the wood stove or making sure the windows were sealed against drafts, and Josephine would invite him in for coffee. They would sit by the fire and talk for hours, sharing stories about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Warren told her about his sisters, about the guilt he still sometimes felt that they had been forced to grow up so fast after their parents died. Josephine told him about her mother, about the songs she used to sing, and the way she had always known how to make even the smallest celebration feel magical. One evening in late February, nearly a month after Josephine had arrived at the ranch, Warren arrived at her cottage to find her sitting in the rocking chair with tears streaming down her face. She held a letter in her hands, and he knew before she spoke what it must be. "My brother," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Samuel wrote to me. He made it safely to our aunt's house in Kansas City. He is working in a print shop and learning the trade. He says he is happy, that he feels safe for the first time since our father died. He wanted me to know so I would not worry." "That is wonderful news," Warren said, kneeling beside her chair and taking her free hand in his. "Why are you crying?" "Because I am relieved," she said, laughing through her tears. "Because I have been so terrified that something happened to him, that Crenshaw's men caught him, or that he did not have enough money to make it all the way to Kansas. And now I know he is safe, and it feels like a weight has been lifted off my chest. These are good tears, Warren. Happy tears." Warren reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, and in that moment, something passed between them that could not be put into words. It was acknowledgement, recognition of the bond that had been forming between them since that frozen morning at the well. Josephine set the letter aside and leaned forward, resting her forehead against Warren's. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing in sync, their hearts beating in a rhythm that seemed to echo between them. "Josephine," Warren said softly, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I need to tell you something, and I hope it does not frighten you or make you uncomfortable." "What is it?" she whispered. "I think I am falling in love with you," he said, the words simple and honest. "Maybe I started falling that first morning when I heard you crying. I do not know. All I know is that somewhere along the way, making sure you are safe stopped being just about doing the right thing. It became about protecting someone I care about more than I have cared about anyone in a very long time. If those feelings are not welcome, tell me now, and I will step back. But I had to be honest with you." Josephine pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, and what he saw there made his heart soar. There was no fear, no uncertainty, only warmth and affection, and something deeper that made her honey-colored eyes shine in the firelight. "You are not alone in those feelings," she said. "I have been trying not to acknowledge them because everything has been so complicated and dangerous. I thought it would be foolish to let myself feel something real when I did not know if I would even survive the next week. But I cannot deny it anymore. I love you, Warren. You saved my life, and then you gave me a reason to want to live it." He kissed her then, a gentle kiss that held all the tenderness and promise of new love. She melted into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck as he pulled her close. The kiss deepened, and for a few precious moments the rest of the world fell away. There was no Silas Crenshaw, no danger lurking in the shadows, no painful past or uncertain future. There was only the two of them and the connection that had formed between their hearts. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Warren rested his forehead against hers once more. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this right, with Robert and Margaret's blessing and with the intention of building a life together if you will have me." "I would like that very much," Josephine said, smiling through fresh tears. "I would like that more than anything." The courting that followed was sweet and earnest, conducted under the watchful and approving eyes of the Rutherfords. Margaret was delighted, having suspected for weeks that something was developing between her young helper and the ranch foreman. Robert gave his blessing with a firm handshake and a warning to Warren that he had better treat Josephine with the respect she deserved. Warren assured him that he had no intention of doing otherwise. They stole moments together whenever they could, walking along the frozen creek that ran through the ranch property, sitting together at meals with the easy comfort of two people who fit naturally into each other's lives, sharing quiet evenings in the cottage where they talked and dreamed about the future they were beginning to believe might actually be possible. Warren was careful to maintain propriety, always leaving before it got too late, always making sure their time together could not be misconstrued by anyone watching. He wanted to protect Josephine's reputation as fiercely as he protected her physical safety. Spring began to creep into the Colorado mountains, bringing warmer days and the first signs of new growth breaking through the snow. With the changing season came news from Fort Garland that both relieved and disturbed them. Silas Crenshaw had left town. According to Sheriff Bradley, Crenshaw had packed up his most valuable possessions and headed west to California, reportedly to expand his operations in the gold fields where law enforcement was even more sparse than in Colorado. He had left his saloon in the hands of a manager with instructions to keep the business running, but Crenshaw himself was gone, Robert and Warren discussed this development at length, trying to decide if it was genuine or some kind of trap. Finally, Sheriff Bradley himself rode out to the Double R to give them his assessment. "I think he really left," Bradley said, accepting a cup of coffee from Margaret and settling into a chair in the main room. "Two of my informants confirmed that they saw him on the stage heading west, and his closest associates have been scrambling to figure out what to do without him around. I think the legal notice and the fact that you stood up to him publicly made him realize this particular fight was not worth his time. He has bigger fish to fry in California." "So Josephine is safe?" Warren asked, hardly daring to believe it could be that simple. "I would not say she should let her guard down completely," Bradley cautioned. "Crenshaw is unpredictable and he has a long memory. But for now, yes, I believe she is safe. The immediate threat has passed." The relief that washed over Warren was so intense it left him feeling almost lightheaded. He thanked Bradley profusely, and after the sheriff left, he went immediately to find Josephine. She was in the kitchen of the main house, helping Margaret prepare bread dough for baking, and when he told her the news, she sank into a chair with her flour-covered hands pressed to her mouth. "It is really over?" she asked, her voice muffled behind her hands. "He is really gone." "It looks that way," Warren said, kneeling beside her chair. "You can stop looking over your shoulder, Josephine. You can start planning for a future without fear." She threw her arms around him, not caring about the flour that transferred onto his shirt, and he held her tight, feeling her body shake with sobs of relief. Margaret watched them with tears in her own eyes, touched by the depth of emotion between the young couple. Over the following weeks, as the threat of Crenshaw receded into memory, Warren and Josephine's relationship deepened and flourished. They were inseparable, spending every free moment together and making plans for the life they wanted to build. Warren spoke to Robert about the possibility of building a house on a piece of land at the edge of the ranch property, a place where he and Josephine could start their family once they were married. Robert not only approved, but offered to provide the lumber and help with the construction, saying it was the least he could do for his most trusted foreman. One evening in early May, with wildflowers blooming across the meadows and the air sweet with the promise of summer, Warren took Josephine to the place where their house would be built. They stood on a slight rise that overlooked the valley, the mountains rising majestically in the distance, and the ranch spread out below them like a patchwork quilt of fields and pastures. "I can see it," Josephine said softly, her hand clasped in Warren's. "Our house right here, with a porch where we can sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. A garden where I can grow vegetables and flowers. Maybe a barn for a milk cow and some chickens. And children," Warren added, pulling her close against his side. "I can see children running through those fields, laughing and playing. Our children, yours and mine." She looked up at him, her honey-colored eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Zimmerman?" He turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his and looking at her with such love and tenderness that it made her breath catch. "Not yet," he said. "When I propose to you, I want to do it properly, with a ring and all the words that express how much you mean to me. But this is a promise. I am going to spend the rest of my life loving you and doing everything in my power to make you happy. That is not a maybe or a someday. It is a certainty." "Then I suppose I will have to wait for the actual proposal," Josephine said, smiling even as tears gathered in her eyes. "But Warren, you should know that, whenever you do ask, my answer will be yes. It has always been yes since the moment you told me you would carry my pain." They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed to celebrate the love blooming between them. It was a moment of perfect peace and perfect joy, the kind of moment that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. True to his word, Warren waited another month before proposing, using that time to save every spare penny from his wages so he could purchase a ring from the jeweler in Fort Garland. It was a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest by some standards but precious beyond measure to him, because it represented his commitment and his dreams for their future together. He carried it in his pocket for a week, waiting for the perfect moment to present itself. That moment came on a warm June evening when he and Josephine rode out to the old McAllister ranch, to the frozen well where he had first found her weeping. It was no longer frozen now, the stones warm beneath the summer sun, and the surrounding land had been transformed by the season from a desolate white wasteland into a meadow of wildflowers and waving grass. "Why did you bring me here?" Josephine asked as they dismounted, though she thought she might already know the answer. "Because this is where our story began," Warren said, taking her hand and leading her to the well. "This is the place where I found you at your lowest point, where you were ready to give up on life. I want to come back here with you now so we can see how far you have come, how much you have healed and grown. And I want to ask you a question in the very spot where I first promised to carry your pain." He sank to one knee on the ground that had once been frozen but now was soft and warm, and he pulled the small velvet box from his pocket. When he opened it, the diamond caught the sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across Josephine's face. "Josephine Hayes," he said, his voice strong and clear and filled with emotion. "You came into my life as a stranger in need, but you have become the person I cannot imagine living without. You are brave and strong and kind, and you have a heart that has survived more pain than anyone should have to bear. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face that kind of pain again. I want to build a home with you, raise children with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Josephine's face as she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Yes, yes, Warren, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he stood and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy. They kissed there by the well, and the ghosts of pain and desperation that had once haunted that place seemed to dissipate, replaced by the promise of love and hope and new beginnings. They were married in late July in a small ceremony at the Double R Ranch, with Sheriff Bradley serving as one of the witnesses, and Margaret Rutherford crying happy tears throughout the entire service. Robert walked Josephine down the makeshift aisle that had been set up in the yard, giving her away with a kiss on her forehead and a whispered reminder that she would always have a place with them if she ever needed it. The ranch hands attended in their Sunday best, along with a few neighbors from surrounding ranches who had become friends to Josephine during her months at the Double R. Josephine wore a dress that Margaret had helped her sew from ivory fabric, ordered specially from Denver. It was simple but elegant, with long sleeves and a fitted bodice that emphasized her slender figure. She had woven wildflowers into her dark hair, and she carried a bouquet of the same blooms that grew in the meadow where their future house would stand. Warren wore his best suit, and when he saw her walking toward him, his eyes filled with tears of happiness that he did not bother to hide. The ceremony was conducted by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through the area, a kind older gentleman who spoke about love and commitment with the wisdom of someone who had seen many marriages over his long career. When Warren and Josephine exchanged their vows, their voices were steady and sure, each word a solemn promise that they meant with every fiber of their being. "I, Warren, take you, Josephine, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Warren said, holding her hands and looking into her eyes. "I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to stand by you in times of joy and times of sorrow, to be your partner and your protector, to carry your pain and share your happiness. From this day forward, you will never be alone again. I, Josephine, take you, Warren, to be my lawfully wedded husband," Josephine replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to stand by you in times of joy and times of sorrow, to be your partner and your support, to build a life and a home with you. You saved me when I had given up hope, and I promise to spend every day showing you what that gift means to me." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and gave Warren permission to kiss his bride, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests echoed across the valley. Warren kissed Josephine with a tenderness that made more than one tough ranch hand wipe surreptitiously at his eyes, and Josephine kissed him back with all the love and gratitude and joy that filled her heart to overflowing. The celebration that followed was joyful and lively, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Robert had arranged for a fiddle player to come from town, and the ranch hands took turns dancing with the bride while Warren looked on with a smile that never left his face. Margaret had outdone herself with the food, preparing a feast that included roasted beef, fresh bread, vegetable dishes, and a beautiful cake that she had somehow managed to keep hidden until the perfect moment. As the evening wound down and the stars came out overhead, Warren and Josephine slipped away from the party and walked hand in hand to the guest cottage that had been transformed into a proper home for them to share, until their new house was completed. Someone, probably Margaret, had decorated the inside with candles and flowers, creating a romantic atmosphere that made Josephine's heart flutter. Warren closed the door behind them and turned to face his wife, marveling at how right that word felt. Wife. Josephine was his wife now, bound to him by law and by love, and the thought filled him with a sense of completion he had never known was missing. "Are you happy?" he asked, pulling her gently into his arms. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "6 months ago, I was ready to die by that frozen well. I had given up on everything, on life, on hope, on the possibility of ever feeling safe or loved again. And then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I did not even know how to pray. You saved me, Warren, in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," he said softly. "I did not realize how lonely I was, how much I had been going through the motions of living without really engaging with life. You woke something up in me that had been sleeping for a long time. You gave me a reason to want more than just surviving. You gave me a reason to want to thrive." They made love for the first time that night with a tenderness and passion that bonded them even more deeply than the vows they had spoken. Warren was gentle and patient, making sure Josephine felt safe and cherished every moment. She gave herself to him completely, trusting him with her body and her heart in a way she had never trusted anyone before. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, whispering about their dreams and their future until they finally drifted off to sleep in each other's arms. The months that followed were a time of building and growing, both literally and figuratively. Construction on their new house began in August, with Warren, Robert, and several of the ranch hands working together to raise the frame and put on the roof before the winter weather set in. It was hard work, but it was also joyful, each nail driven and each board placed bringing them closer to the home they would share. Josephine continued to help Margaret with the household work, but she also began to focus on creating a home of her own. She sewed curtains for the windows of the new house, collected dishes and cooking utensils from the general store in Fort Garland, and planned the garden she would plant come spring. Margaret became her mentor and friend, teaching her the skills she would need to manage her own household and sharing wisdom about marriage and family life. In October, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The realization came one morning when she woke feeling nauseous and dizzy, and Margaret took one look at her pale face before ushering her into a chair and bringing her a cup of ginger tea. "I think you might be expecting," Margaret said gently, and Josephine's hand flew to her still flat stomach. "I think you might be right," she whispered, wonder and joy flooding through her. "Oh, Margaret, I am going to have a baby." Telling Warren was one of the happiest moments of Josephine's life. She waited until they were alone in the cottage that evening, and then she took his hand and placed it on her stomach, looking up into his eyes. "We are going to have a baby," she said simply, and she watched as understanding dawned on his face, followed by pure elation. "A baby," he repeated as if he could not quite believe it. "Truly, truly," she confirmed, laughing as he swept her up into his arms and spun her around, only putting her down when she protested that the spinning made her nausea worse. "I am going to be a father," he said, his voice filled with awe. "We are going to have a child, Josephine. Our child." They spent the evening making plans and dreaming about the baby who would arrive sometime in late spring. Warren became even more protective of Josephine, insisting that she not overwork herself and frequently checking in to make sure she was resting enough. Margaret and Robert were delighted by the news, already thinking of themselves as honorary grandparents to the coming child. The house was completed in November, just as the first serious snows began to fall. It was everything they had dreamed of: a sturdy two-story structure with a spacious kitchen, a comfortable sitting room, and 3 bedrooms upstairs for the family they hoped to grow. Warren carried Josephine over the threshold on a cold December afternoon, both of them laughing as they stepped into their new home for the first time as its official occupants. "It is perfect," Josephine said, turning in a slow circle to take in the room. "It is everything I imagined and more." "It is a house," Warren corrected, pulling her close. "It becomes a home when we fill it with our love and our life together. That is what we will do starting today." They moved in over the following week, carrying their modest possessions from the guest cottage and arranging furniture that Robert and Margaret gifted them as a housewarming present. Josephine hung the curtains she had sewn and arranged her dishes in the kitchen. Warren built shelves in the sitting room for the few books they owned and hung a portrait of his parents over the fireplace. By the time they were finished, the house did indeed feel like a home, warm and welcoming despite the cold winter wind that rattled the windows. Christmas that year was a joyful affair, celebrated with the Rutherfords in the main house with a feast and an exchange of gifts. Warren gave Josephine a beautiful shawl he had secretly commissioned from a weaver in town. Soft wool dyed in shades of blue and green that reminded him of her eyes in different lights. Josephine gave Warren a hand-tooled leather journal where he could record the growth of their ranch and family, along with a promise that she would fill it with stories of their life together. Winter passed slowly but peacefully, and spring returned to the Colorado mountains with a burst of color and life. Josephine's pregnancy progressed well, her belly growing round and her face glowing with health and happiness. Margaret fussed over her constantly, making sure she ate enough and rested properly. Warren was even more devoted, if such a thing were possible, anticipating her every need and talking to their unborn child through the swell of her stomach. In May, as the wildflowers bloomed across the meadows just as they had the year before, Josephine went into labor. Margaret was with her, having moved into the guest room of their house a week earlier in preparation for this moment. Warren paced anxiously downstairs, while Margaret and the midwife they had brought from Fort Garland attended to Josephine upstairs. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following morning. Warren could hear Josephine's cries of pain, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He wanted to be with her, to hold her hand and tell her she was strong enough to do this, but Margaret had firmly told him that his place was downstairs, out of the way. So he paced and prayed and waited, Robert sitting with him in quiet support. Finally, just as the sun was climbing over the eastern mountains, Warren heard a new sound, the sharp, angry cry of a newborn baby. His knees nearly buckled with relief, and he started toward the stairs, only to be stopped by Robert's hand on his shoulder. "Wait," Robert said gently. "Give them a few minutes to clean up and make sure both mother and baby are well." Those few minutes felt like an eternity, but finally, Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs with a smile on her face that told Warren everything was all right. "Come meet your son," she said, and Warren took the stairs two at a time. Josephine was propped up in their bed, her dark hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but her smile when she saw Warren was radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was a tiny baby with a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face that was the most beautiful thing Warren had ever seen. "Our son," Josephine said softly, her voice hoarse from the hours of labor. "Warren, we have a son." Warren sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out with trembling hands to touch the baby's impossibly small fingers. The infant grabbed onto his finger with a surprisingly strong grip, and Warren felt tears stream down his face. "He is perfect," Warren whispered. "You are perfect." "Thank you, Josephine. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas Robert Zimmerman, after Warren's father and the man who had given them both a chance at a new life. Little Thomas grew quickly, thriving under the devoted care of his parents and the honorary grandparents who spoiled him shamelessly. The house filled with the sounds of a baby's cries and laughter, and both Warren and Josephine marveled at how their lives had been transformed. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Anna Margaret Zimmerman, named after Josephine's mother and the woman who had become her surrogate mother. Anna had her mother's honey-colored eyes and her father's gentle temperament, and Thomas took to his role as big brother with enthusiasm. The family grew and flourished, each child adding new dimension and joy to the love that Warren and Josephine shared. Years passed in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Warren continued to work as foreman of the Double R Ranch, his responsibilities growing as Robert aged and began to gradually step back from the day-to-day operations. Josephine became known throughout the valley as a skilled healer, learning the art of herbal medicine from Margaret and using it to help neighbors and ranch hands who fell ill or injured. Their home was always open, always welcoming, a place where people knew they would find kindness and support. Samuel, Josephine's brother, came to visit when Thomas was 3 years old, making the journey from Kansas City with his new wife to meet the nephew and niece he had only heard about in letters. The reunion between brother and sister was tearful and joyful, and Warren watched with a full heart as Samuel thanked him repeatedly for saving Josephine's life. "She is my whole world," Samuel said, gripping Warren's hand firmly. "If you had not found her that morning, if you had not stopped to help, I would have lost her. I can never repay you for what you did." "You do not need to repay me," Warren said. "Your sister has given me more than I ever could have imagined. A family, a purpose, a reason to wake up grateful every single morning. If anyone is in debt, it is me." News of Silas Crenshaw occasionally filtered back to Fort Garland through travelers and newspapers. He had indeed gone to California and built an empire in the gold fields, but his ruthlessness had finally caught up with him. In 1887, 5 years after he had left Colorado, word came that Crenshaw had been killed in a shootout with a rival gang. Josephine felt no joy at the news, only a quiet relief that the shadow of his threat was finally and permanently lifted. Robert Rutherford passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1890 at the age of 63, and the entire valley mourned the loss of a man who had been a pillar of the community. In his will, he left the Double R Ranch to Warren, with the stipulation that Margaret would always have a home there for as long as she lived. Warren was humbled and honored by the trust Robert had placed in him, and he vowed to run the ranch with the same integrity and fairness that Robert had always shown. Under Warren's management, the Double R continued to prosper and grow. He hired good men, treated them fairly, and built a reputation as someone who could be trusted to keep his word. Josephine worked beside him, managing the household and raising their children with the same strength and grace she had shown from the moment Warren first met her. By 1895, Thomas was 10 years old and already showing signs of becoming a capable rancher like his father. Anna was 8, with her mother's gentle spirit and a talent for music that delighted everyone who heard her sing. The family had grown to include 2 more children. William, who was 5 and fearless, always getting into mischief that made Josephine shake her head in exasperation while secretly smiling, and little Catherine, just 2 years old, who was the baby of the family and utterly adored by her older siblings. One spring morning in 1896, 14 years after that frozen January dawn when their lives had first intersected, Warren woke early and slipped out of bed without waking Josephine. He dressed quietly and made his way outside, walking through the awakening ranch toward a destination he had not visited in years. The old McAllister Ranch was still abandoned, the land never claimed by anyone else, and the well remained as it had been. A circle of stones with a weathered wooden cap that had somehow survived the years. Wildflowers bloomed all around it, and birds sang in the trees that had grown up nearby. Warren stood by the well for a long time, remembering that desperate morning when he had heard a young woman weeping and had made the decision to stop and offer help. That single decision had changed everything. It had brought Josephine into his life, and through her, he had found love, purpose, family, and a fullness of heart he had never known was possible. All of it had started here, at this forgotten well in the middle of nowhere, with a simple offer to carry someone else's pain. "Thank you," he said softly to whatever force had guided him to this spot that morning, whether it was God or fate or simple chance. "Thank you for giving me the wisdom to stop, and thank you for giving me Josephine." "You are welcome," a voice said behind him, and he turned to find Josephine standing there with a knowing smile on her face. "I woke up and you were gone. I knew where you must have come." "How did you know?" he asked, reaching out to take her hand as she came to stand beside him. "Because this place matters," she said simply, looking down at the well. "This is where we began. I knew that sooner or later you would want to come back and remember." They stood together in the morning light, older now, marked by years and experience but still deeply connected to the people they had been on that frozen dawn. Josephine rested her head on Warren's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, holding her close. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if I had not stopped that morning?" Warren asked quietly. "Sometimes," Josephine admitted. "But then I stop myself because imagining a world without you and our children is too painful. What I think about instead is how grateful I am that you did stop, that you offered to carry my pain, and that you kept that promise every single day since. You have been my strength, my protection, my partner, and my love. You have given me a life I never dreamed possible." We gave each other that life, Warren corrected. Your courage, your resilience, your capacity to heal and to love despite everything you went through, those things have inspired me every single day. You are the bravest person I have ever known, Josephine. They kissed there by the well, the same spot where their story had begun. And the love between them was as strong and vital as it had been on their wedding day, perhaps even stronger for having been tested and proven through years of building a life together. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, and their eyes held the contentment of people who knew they had found their place in the world. "Come on," Josephine said, tugging on his hand. "We should get back before the children wake up and start wondering where we are. You know Thomas will try to make breakfast and end up making a mess that takes all morning to clean." Warren laughed, the sound rich and warm. "He gets that from you, you know, that determination to help even when he does not quite know what he is doing. And he gets his stubbornness from you," Josephine shot back, but there was no heat in it, only affection. They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, talking and laughing, the same easy partnership they had developed over 14 years of marriage. The house came into view, smoke rising from the chimney where someone, probably Thomas, had started the morning fire. They could hear children's voices calling for their parents, and both Warren and Josephine quickened their pace, eager to get back to the family they had created together. That evening, after the children were fed and bathed and tucked into their beds, Warren and Josephine sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. Margaret had come for dinner and had stayed late, playing with her honorary grandchildren and filling the house with her laughter. She had finally headed back to the main house, and now Warren and Josephine had this quiet moment to themselves. "You remember what I said to you that first morning?" Warren asked, his arm around Josephine's shoulders as she leaned against him. "You said many things," Josephine replied with a smile. "Which part are you thinking of?" "I told you to tell me your pain so I could carry it," Warren said. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. Whatever burdens you carry, you never have to carry them alone." "I know," Josephine said softly, "and the same is true for you. Your pain is my pain, your joy is my joy. That is what it means to be partners, to be husband and wife. We carry each other." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear one of the children stirring, probably William having a dream. Josephine started to rise, but Warren gently held her in place. "I will go," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You rest. You have been on your feet all day." He went inside and climbed the stairs to the children's room, finding William sitting up in bed with tears on his cheeks. Warren sat on the edge of the bed and pulled his son into his arms, rubbing circles on his back until the boy calmed down. "Bad dream?" Warren asked quietly, and William nodded against his chest. "Do you want to talk about it?" "I dreamed you and Mama went away and did not come back," William whispered. "I was scared." "That is not going to happen," Warren assured him firmly. "Your mother and I are not going anywhere. We will always be here for you and your brother and sisters. Always. Do you understand?" William nodded again, and Warren tucked him back into bed, pulling the blankets up to his chin and smoothing the boy's hair back from his forehead. "Go back to sleep now. Tomorrow is a new day, and there will be adventures to have and things to learn. You need your rest so you can be ready." "I love you, Papa," William mumbled, already drifting back toward sleep. "I love you too, son," Warren said, his heart full to bursting. "More than you will ever know." He returned to the porch where Josephine was waiting, and she looked at him with a question in her eyes. "Everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Warren said, sitting back down and pulling her close once more. "William had a nightmare, but he is fine now. Our children are healthy, our home is strong, our love is true. What more could we possibly ask for?" "Nothing," Josephine said, resting her hand over his heart and feeling its steady beat beneath her palm. "We have everything that matters right here." The years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to the rich tapestry of their life together. Thomas grew into a fine young man who shared his father's values and his mother's compassion. He took over more and more responsibility on the ranch, proving himself capable and trustworthy. Anna developed her musical talents, eventually teaching piano and voice to children in Fort Garland, and bringing culture and beauty to the rough frontier community. William mellowed as he grew, his wild energy channeled into a talent for training horses that made him valuable to ranchers throughout the territory. Catherine, the baby of the family, grew into a young woman with her mother's healing gifts, studying under Josephine and eventually taking over much of the medical care for the ranch. Warren and Josephine grew older together with grace, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced challenges as all couples do, difficult seasons that threatened the ranch's prosperity, illnesses that tested their strength, moments of doubt and fear that required them to lean on each other. But through it all, they held fast to the commitment they had made on that frozen January morning so many years before. To carry each other's burdens, to share each other's joys, to build a life together that honored the second chance they had been given. In 1910, Warren and Josephine celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together family and friends from across Colorado. Samuel came from Kansas City with his wife and 4 children. Margaret presided over the festivities like the matriarch she had become, and the ranch was filled with music and laughter and love. Warren and Josephine danced together under strings of lanterns hung across the yard, moving with the easy grace of 2 people who knew each other's rhythms perfectly. 30 years, Josephine said, looking up into Warren's face, which was lined now with age but still handsome to her eyes. "Can you believe it has been 30 years since you found me by that well? It feels like yesterday and like a lifetime all at once," Warren replied, his blue eyes still clear and bright despite his 54 years. "I have loved you every single day of those 30 years, and I will love you for however many more we are given." "Forever," Josephine said softly. "We will love each other forever, even beyond this life." "Forever," Warren agreed, and he kissed her there in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by the family and community they had helped build through 3 decades of hard work, dedication, and unwavering love. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Warren found himself once more drawn to the edge of the property, looking out toward where the old McAllister well stood in the distance. Josephine came to stand beside him, and they held hands in the darkness, their fingers intertwined with the comfortable familiarity of 30 years together. "I have been thinking," Warren said after a long moment of peaceful silence, "about how one moment, one decision can change everything. If I had ridden past that morning without stopping, my entire life would have been different. I would have missed out on the greatest joy I have ever known." "But you did not ride past," Josephine reminded him gently. "You stopped, you listened, you offered to carry my pain." "That tells me everything about who you are, Warren. You are a man who sees suffering and does not look away. You are a man who keeps his promises. You are the man I fell in love with and the man I still love with all my heart." "I would do it all again," Warren said, turning to face her fully. "Every single moment, every challenge, every joy. I would choose you every time." "And I would choose you," Josephine replied, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "Always and forever I would choose you." They stood there for a long time, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. The ranch they had created together would continue for generations, a legacy of love and hard work that would touch countless lives. The children they had raised would carry forward the values they had instilled: compassion, courage, integrity, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest thing you can do is stop and offer to carry someone else's pain. As they finally turned and walked back toward their home, the lights glowing warmly in the windows, Warren thought back one more time to that frozen January morning in 1882. He remembered the sound of weeping that had pierced through the wind, the sight of a desperate young woman kneeling by a frozen well, the impulse that had made him stop and offer help. He remembered the words that had come from somewhere deep inside him, words that had somehow changed both their lives forever. "Tell me your pain so I can carry it." In the end, that was what love was, wasn't it? The willingness to carry each other's burdens, to share each other's sorrows, to stand together against whatever storms life brought. He and Josephine had done that for 30 years, and God willing, they would do it for many more. They climbed the porch steps together, and Warren opened the door, gesturing for Josephine to enter first. Before she did, she paused and looked back at him, her honey-colored eyes still as beautiful as they had been the first day he saw her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For my life, for our family, for your love. Thank you for being the man who stopped by a frozen well and saved me." "Thank you for letting me," Warren replied. "Thank you for trusting me, for loving me, for building this life with me. You saved me too, Josephine. Never forget that." They went inside together, closing the door against the night and entering the warmth of the home they had created. Their story had begun with tears and desperation, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the transforming power of love and the importance of offering compassion to those in need. The frozen well where they had first met remained standing for many years after that, a silent witness to the beginning of a love story that would be told and retold by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Eventually, someone built a small bench near the well and placed a plaque that read, "Where love began from compassion, 1882. Travelers who passed by would sometimes rest there and wonder about the story behind the plaque. The locals would tell them about Warren Zimmerman and Josephine Hayes, about how a cowboy had found a woman weeping by the frozen well at dawn, and how he had offered to carry her pain. They would tell about the love that had grown from that moment of kindness, about the family they had built and the legacy they had left behind. And sometimes, if you visited that spot on a cold January morning just as the sun was rising, people swore you could feel something special in the air, a sense of peace and hope and the enduring power of love that conquers all darkness. Because some places hold memories so powerful that they echo through time, and some love stories are so true that they become part of the very land itself. Warren and Josephine lived long, full lives, surrounded by the love of their children and grandchildren, respected by their community, and devoted to each other until their very last breaths. When Warren passed away at the age of 78, Josephine held his hand and whispered the words that had become their private mantra over the decades they had shared. "I choose you. Always and forever I choose you." She followed him 3 years later, having lived to see her youngest grandchild married and settled into a happy life. Her last words, spoken to Thomas as he sat by her bedside, were about his father. "He saved me," she said, her voice weak but clear. "Not just from the cold that morning, but from a lifetime of fear and loneliness. He showed me what love really means. Remember that, Thomas. Remember that the greatest thing you can do in this life is offer to carry someone else's pain. That is what your father taught me, and that is what I want to pass on to you and your children." Thomas buried his mother next to his father on a hillside overlooking the Double R Ranch, with the mountains rising majestically in the distance and the valley spreading out below like a patchwork quilt. On their shared headstone, he had inscribed the words that had defined their relationship and their legacy. He asked to carry her pain. She gave him her heart. Together they built a love that would last forever. And it did last forever, not just in memory but in the lives they had touched, the family they had created, and the example they had set for all who came after them. Their story became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is hope. Even when you feel most alone, there are people who will stop and offer help. And sometimes, the smallest act of compassion can grow into the greatest love story ever told. The ranch they built together continued for generations, managed by their descendants who carried forward the values Warren and Josephine had instilled. The guest cottage where they had first lived as newlyweds was preserved and eventually turned into a small museum, filled with photographs and mementos of their life together. Visitors came from all over to see it and to hear the story of the cowboy and the woman at the frozen well. In Fort Garland, a street was eventually named after them, Zimmerman Avenue, running through the heart of the town that had once harbored Silas Crenshaw but had ultimately been shaped more by the influence of good people like Warren and Josephine. The old saloon where Crenshaw had operated was torn down long ago, replaced by a schoolhouse that educated generations of children in compassion and courage. The frozen well itself became something of a landmark, a destination for couples who wanted to start their relationships in a place blessed by true love. Young men would bring their sweethearts there to propose, invoking the spirit of Warren and Josephine. Young women would visit when they felt lost or afraid, drawing strength from the knowledge that another woman had once stood in that same spot and found the courage to accept help and to love again. And so the legacy continued, rippling outward through time and space, touching lives in ways that Warren and Josephine could never have imagined on that frozen January morning when their paths first crossed. Their story proved that love can bloom in the harshest conditions, that compassion can transform lives, and that the decision to stop and help a stranger can change the course of history in ways both large and small. In the end, that is what mattered most, not the wealth they accumulated or the land they owned, but the love they shared and the lives they touched. They had taken pain and transformed it into purpose, taken desperation and transformed it into hope, taken loneliness and transformed it into family. They had shown that even in the wild and often brutal landscape of the Old West, gentleness and compassion could not only survive but thrive. Their children grew old telling the story of their parents' first meeting, never tiring of describing how Warren had found Josephine by the frozen well, and how his simple offer to carry her pain had led to a lifetime of love. Their grandchildren passed the story to their own children, and those children to theirs, until Warren and Josephine Zimmerman became more than just people who had lived and died. They became symbols of everything good and true about love, the courage it takes to trust, the strength required to be vulnerable, the wisdom to accept help when it is offered, and the grace to offer help when you see someone in need. And somewhere, beyond the boundaries of time and space, two souls remained eternally connected, their love undiminished by death. Because some loves are so deep and so true that they transcend the physical world and become part of something greater, something eternal. Warren and Josephine's love was one of those rare and precious bonds, a beacon of light that would shine through the ages, reminding all who heard their story that love really does conquer all, that compassion really does change lives, and that sometimes the greatest adventure begins with 5 simple words. Tell me your pain so I can carry it.